Throughout history, there have been individuals whose actions have left a trail of devastation and terror in their wake. From notorious mobsters and serial killers to ruthless gangsters and con artists, these individuals have committed unimaginable crimes that have shocked the world. But what drives someone to become the embodiment of evil? Prepare for a heart-pounding journey into the depths of human darkness. Let the descent begin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, appeared to be an ordinary man to the outside world. However, beneath his facade lay a disturbing darkness. In the 1990s, the nation would be horrified as Dahmer's gruesome series of murders came to light. Although his reign of terror began in the late 1970s, it wasn't until the 1990s that the full extent of his horrifying crimes was exposed. Dahmer was a serial killer and a necrophile, meaning he had a sexual attraction to corpses. His crimes followed a chilling pattern. He frequently targeted vulnerable young men of Asian or African American descent, luring them with promises of money, alcohol, or a place to stay. Once in his apartment, Dahmer would incapacitate his victims by drugging them with a combination of alcohol and sedatives. Subsequently, he would strangle or bludgeon them to death. His apartment became a chamber of horrors, where he dismembered the bodies and engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. Dahmer went even further, meticulously preserving body parts as chilling souvenirs. Some remains were found stored in his refrigerator and freezer. The authorities finally caught up with this monstrous killer in July 1991, when a traumatized man named Tracy Edwards managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment. Despite being handcuffed, Edwards flagged down police officers, leading them to the horrifying crime scene. The officers discovered disturbing Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies and other gruesome evidence that left them in shock. Dahmer's arrest in 1991 initiated a massive investigation. His trial became a spectacle, with the world watching in horror as the gruesome details of his crimes were unveiled. He faced charges for 17 murders and later confessed to all of them. While Dahmer's defense argued that he suffered from mental illness, the prosecution depicted him as a cunning and unremorseful killer. In 1992, he was found guilty of 16 counts of murder and sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, born in 1870, exhibited signs of a disturbed mind from a young age. Growing up in an abusive and dysfunctional family, he endured both physical and psychological torment that would go on to shape his twisted psyche. Fish's criminal activities began in the early 1920s, but it was during the Great Depression that he committed his most abhorrent acts, earning him the notorious moniker, the Brooklyn Vampire. Fish was a predator who preyed upon the vulnerable, with young children being his primary targets. His methods were nothing short of horrifying. Fish would respond to personal ads in newspapers under the guise of seeking employment. By doing so, he managed to infiltrate families, gaining their trust while concealing his sinister intentions. Once inside their homes, he would often subject the children to molestation before proceeding to commit unspeakable acts of violence. However, his true malevolence was unveiled when he turned to cannibalism. The abduction and murder of Grace Budd in 1928 marked Fish's most infamous crime. Under the pretense of a job offer, he lured the innocent 10-year-old girl away from her family, subjecting her to a nightmarish ordeal. Fish tortured, mutilated, and ultimately murdered Grace, even consuming parts of her remains. This horrifying crime sent shockwaves throughout the nation, leading the police to swiftly pursue Fish. Fish's apprehension resulted from a disturbing letter he had penned to Grace Budd's family, providing a gruesome confession to the murder. The letter was traced back to him, leading to his arrest in 1934. As investigators delved into Fish's sordid past, they uncovered a plethora of horrifying crimes spanning several decades. He had perpetrated countless acts of violence and molestation against children, leaving behind a trail of suffering. Fish often described his perverse acts with a disturbing relish, recounting them in chilling detail and displaying a horrifying lack of remorse. A jury found Fish guilty of murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish paid the ultimate price for his heinous crimes, meeting his end in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper, born in 1948 in Burbank, California, had a troubled childhood marked by a strained relationship with his abusive mother, Clarnell Kemper. This tumultuous upbringing would plant the seeds of violence that would later come to define him. Edmund Kemper's criminal activities began in the early 1970s. During the summer of 1972, Kemper embarked on a killing spree that claimed the lives of 6 young women, primarily college students. He would pick them up while they were hitchhiking, transporting them to remote locations where he would brutally end their lives. His method methods were gruesome, and the violence he inflicted was beyond words. However, Kemper's reign of terror didn't stop there. In a shocking turn of events, he directed his murderous tendencies towards his own family. On a fateful day in 1973, he brutally murdered his mother and her friend. He even went as far as decapitating his mother's body and committing unspeakable acts with her remains. As the police closed in on Kemper, he finally surrendered in April 1973, bringing his reign of terror to an end. His arrest marked the beginning of one of the most infamous trials in American history. During his interrogation, Kemper confessed to his gruesome crimes with chilling detail. He displayed no remorse for the horrors he had inflicted upon his victims, maintaining a calm demeanor and providing detailed accounts of the murders that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Kemper's trial was a grim spectacle, with the world watching in horror. Despite his confession, his defense team attempted to argue that he was legally insane. Nevertheless, the overwhelming evidence of his deliberate acts of violence led to his guilty verdict in 1973, with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Edmund Kemper was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. While in prison, Kemper gained notoriety for his high intelligence and articulate conversations. He engaged in psychological evaluations, revealing disturbing insights into his psyche. However, his prison life was far from comfortable, as he frequently clashed with fellow inmates, with some even attempting to harm him. In a twisted turn of events, Kemper unsuccessfully attempted suicide in 1973. He remains imprisoned in the California system. Christopher Watts. In 2018, Christopher Watts committed horrifying acts that would forever be remembered in true crime history. Born in 1985 in a small North Carolina town, Watts initially appeared as an ordinary family man, married to his wife Shanann, and a father to 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. However, hidden behind the facade of suburban bliss, a concealed turmoil lurked. Christopher Watts was ensnared in an extramarital affair that was spiraling out of control. As his secrets unraveled, so did his facade of normalcy. On August 13, 2018, Watts committed a shocking act that sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Following a heated argument with his wife Shanann, he strangled her in their Colorado home. Subsequently, Watts smothered his 2 innocent daughters, Bella and Celeste, in their beds. He callously disposed of their lifeless bodies at an oil site where he worked. The heinousness of Watts's actions cannot be overemphasized. The man who had once vowed to protect and cherish his family had transformed into their worst nightmare. His crime left behind a trail of grief and disbelief. The sudden disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste shook their community to its core. Initially, Christopher Watts portrayed the role of the concerned husband and father, pleading for their safe return. However, as investigators delved deeper, his web of lies began to crumble. Overwhelming evidence was stacked against Watts. Security footage revealed him loading his family's lifeless bodies into his truck. Cell phone records and GPS data placed him at the oil site where their remains were discovered. All signs pointed to a premeditated murder. Watts's confession unfolded in stages. Initially, he admitted to killing his wife, Shanann, in a fit of rage, but as the investigation progressed, he confessed to the cold-blooded murder of his daughters, Bella and Celeste. His motive? To embark on a new life with his mistress. Christopher Watts's trial was a grim spectacle, with the world watching in horror as the extent of his malevolent deeds was unveiled. Watts ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder, and the prosecution sought the death penalty. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont on November 24, 1946. While he seemed to have a normal childhood, a sinister darkness lurked beneath the veneer of ordinary life. Ted Bundy's journey took a dark and twisted turn, propelling him onto a path of depravity that would send shockwaves around the world. Bundy's horrifying spree of murders began in the early 1970s, mainly in Washington, Oregon, and Utah. He employed a sinister method of operation, often pretending to be injured or in need of assistance to lure his unsuspecting victims into his grasp. Bundy's crimes were nothing short of chilling. He kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered young women, instilling fear in entire communities. His charismatic charm made it easier for him to gain the trust of his victims. Once he had them under his influence, there was no escape. Ted Bundy was not just a murderer, he was also an adept escape artist. His 2 daring escapes from custody, especially the 1975 breakout that led to a gruesome killing spree in Colorado, only added to the fear and fascination surrounding his case. Thankfully, Bundy's reign of terror came to a halt when he was recaptured in 1975. However, even behind bars, he continued to manipulate and toy with investigators, offering tantalizing morsels of information without ever fully confessing to his crimes. Bundy's trial was a sensational event. He acted as his attorney, a move that allowed him to taunt his victims' families in the courtroom. Yet, the weight of evidence against him was undeniable, and despite his dramatic defense, he was found guilty of multiple counts of murder. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy's reign of terror finally concluded. He was executed Executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, the man who had instilled fear in the hearts of so many was gone, but his legacy of evil endured. He became the very embodiment of evil, a stark reminder that monsters could hide behind a charming smile. His crimes have inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films, continuing to captivate and horrify audiences to this day. Richard Ramirez. Our story unfolds in the mid-1980 SS in Los Angeles, California. The name that would soon strike fear into the hearts of many is Richard Ramirez. Ramirez's reign of terror took root in 1984 as he invaded homes under the cover of darkness, leaving behind a trail of violence and horror. His victims ranged from the elderly to children, and his method of operation was brutally consistent. Equipped with an assortment of weapons, including handguns, knives, and even a hammer, Ramirez mercilessly attacked his victims. Frequently, he bound them, subjecting them to prolonged physical and psychological suffering. However, his brutality didn't stop there. Many of his victims suffered sexual assault, inflicting deep scars on their lives. The city of Los Angeles was seized by fear as Ramirez continued to elude the police. His crimes appeared random, and his ability to vanish into the night only intensified the terror. Residents throughout the city lived in constant fear, locking doors and windows, praying they wouldn't become his next target. Ramirez's audacious crimes escalated as he left cryptic messages at his crime scenes, often drawing pentagrams and declaring his allegiance to Satan. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, and his infamy swelled with each new horrifying incident. As the body count mounted, authorities redoubled their efforts to apprehend Ramirez. The breakthrough occurred in August 1985 when Ramirez's fingerprints were uncovered at a crime scene. His identity was unveiled, prompting an extensive manhunt. His photograph was plastered across the media, and the public was called upon to aid in his capture. On August 31, 1985, an angry mob identified Ramirez in East Los Angeles and pursued him. They apprehended him and began delivering a beating that mirrored the brutality of his crimes. The police arrived in the nick of time to rescue Ramirez from the mob's fury. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Ramirez was condemned to be executed in California's gas chamber. On June 7, 2013, he passed away due to complications related to B-cell lymphoma while still on death row. H. Holmes. Our story takes place in the late 19th century. Herman Webster Mudgett, who would later be known as H. Holmes, was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His unsettling fascination with death and dissection surfaced at a young age. As Holmes grew older, he pursued a career in medicine and eventually relocated to Chicago. It was in this city that he erected his infamous murder castle. This 3-story structure became a chilling labyrinth filled with concealed passages, trapdoors, soundproof chambers, and a basement designed for torture and dissection. The castle became his hideaway, a place of unimaginable horrors. Holmes's reign of terror commenced in earnest as he utilized his charm to ensnare unsuspecting victims, many of them being women seeking employment or companionship. Once inside the murder castle, they endured unspeakable horrors. Holmes's methods of murder were as diverse as they were horrifying, including suffocation, poisoning, and even being confined in a soundproof bank vault to die slowly. Holmes was not only a sadistic killer, but also a consummate manipulator. He secured life insurance policies on many of his victims, designating himself as the beneficiary. Following their deaths, he would collect on these policies, feeding his greed and malevolence. Holmes' reign of terror peaked during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He exploited the massive influx of tourists, luring many to their tragic fate within his murder castle. He may have taken the lives of as many as 200 people during this period, though the exact number remains shrouded in mystery. As the bodies continued to accumulate, so did Holmes's paranoia. Detectives drew closer to him, prompting his flight from Chicago. Nonetheless, his crimes ultimately caught up with him. Holmes was eventually apprehended in Boston for an unrelated offense, and his true identity as a serial killer began to unravel. During the trial, he initially confessed to 27 murders, but later claimed insanity and recanted. Nevertheless, the jury remained unconvinced, and Holmes was convicted of murder. In May 1896, H. Holmes faced the ultimate consequence for his heinous crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On the day of his execution, thousands gathered to witness the end of the man they regarded as the embodiment of evil. Suomu Miyazaki. Here is my attempt to rewrite the article in a more objective manner. Suomu Miyazaki was a Japanese serial killer who was born in 1962 and committed a series of horrific crimes against young girls in the late 1980s. Miyazaki targeted female children between the ages of 4 and 7, abducting them from public places and subjecting them to sexual violence before murdering them. His first known victim was 4-year-old Mari Kano, who Miyazaki abducted in August 1988. He strangled her to death and engaged in acts of necrophilia with her corpse, which was was later discovered in a remote area. Over the next year, Miyazaki continued abducting and murdering young girls, including 7-year-old Ayako Nomoto, whose dismembered remains were found scattered across Saitama Prefecture. Miyazaki's crimes shocked the nation and prompted a major manhunt. He was finally arrested in July 1989 after attempting to abduct another child. Police searches of his home revealed extensive photographic and video evidence documenting his crimes. Miyazaki was subsequently tried, convicted, and sentenced to death on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. After several failed appeals, Miyazaki was executed by hanging in June 2008, almost 20 years after his initial arrest. The details of his crimes were so shocking that they led to increased public debate about violent media and censorship in Japan. Miyazaki's case remains one of the most notorious criminal acts in modern Japanese history. Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia. In the 1970s, he embarked on a horrific killing spree that targeted young girls across South America. Lopez would lure girls between ages 8-12 away from public places, promising gifts or using charm. He would then rape and strangle them, burying their bodies in shallow graves in isolated areas. Lopez operated with terrifying efficiency, raping and murdering up to 300 girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His crimes often went undetected due to the remoteness and poverty of the areas where he found victims. In 1980, Lopez was apprehended by police in Ecuador while attempting to abduct a young girl. Under custody, Lopez began confessing to a staggering number of murders. He led authorities to burial sites, including one in Ecuador containing over 50 bodies. Investigators were stunned by both the brutality and high victim count. Lopez was put on trial in Ecuador in 1981. He was found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to 16 years, the maximum penalty at the time. The relatively short sentence for such an extensive killing spree caused international outcry. However, in 1994, after just 14 years, Lopez was released from prison for good behavior. Fearing a serial killer being set free, authorities initiated an international manhunt. However, Lopez's current whereabouts remain unknown, and he is still considered a fugitive from justice. Lopez's case is one of the most shocking and extensive serial killing sprees in Latin American history. Jack Unterweger. Jack Unterweger was born in Austria on August 16, 1950. His early life was marked by a troubled upbringing, characterized by abuse and a descent into criminal activities. He quickly spiraled into a life of crime, which included theft, assault, and most horrifyingly, murder. Unterweger's most infamous crimes revolved around a series of gruesome murders involving sex workers. Between 1974 and 1992, he embarked on a chilling killing spree that spanned multiple countries, claiming the lives of at least 11 women across Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the United States. His methods were both brutal and profoundly disturbing. Unterweger would approach his victims, often luring them into his car under the pretense of being a client. Once he had them in his control, he would strangle them using their bras or other makeshift ligatures. His actions were marked by a violent and sadistic level of cruelty. As the bodies of his victims continued to accumulate, Unterweger managed to elude capture for years by cunningly exploiting weaknesses in the criminal justice system. He even wrote articles and books masquerading as a reformed criminal while advocating for the rehabilitation of offenders. His eloquent writing and charismatic personality allowed him to gain the sympathy of many. However, in 1992, his reign of terror reached its conclusion. Austrian authorities finally apprehended Unterweger and charged him with multiple counts of murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, encompassing witness testimonies and forensic evidence. Unterweger's trial became a media sensation, with the world watching in shock and horror as the grim details of his crimes were unveiled. He showed no remorse, maintaining his innocence throughout the proceedings. The prosecution depicted a chilling portrait of a man who derived pleasure from the suffering of his victims. In June 1994, Jack Unterweger was convicted of 9 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice was served, and society could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that this monstrous predator would never be free again. Tragically, on the night of June 29, 1994, Unterweger took his own life at Graz Carlau prison by hanging himself with a makeshift rope composed of shoelaces and a cord from a tracksuit, employing the same knot found on all the strangled sex workers. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942, appearing as an ordinary man who concealed a malevolent secret behind his facade. During his youth, Gacy endured a tumultuous relationship with his abusive father, potentially sowing the seeds for his ominous future. Yet Gacy was a master of deceit. He portrayed himself as a thriving businessman and a respected figure within his community. He even entertained as a clown at children's parties, earning him the unsettling moniker of the Killer Clown. But beneath the vibrant makeup and jovial exterior, a monstrous predator danger lurked. Gacy's reign of terror unfolded in the 1970s when young men began vanishing in the Chicago area. What intensified the horror of his crimes was that he lured his victims by offering them employment or financial assistance, exploiting their vulnerabilities. He would then transport them to his residence, where unimaginable horrors awaited. Gacy subjected his victims to ruthless torture and sexual abuse before strangling them to death. He frequently concealed their lifeless bodies beneath his house or disposed of them in nearby rivers. The chilling truth about Gacy began to surface in 1978 when 15-year-old Robert Peist disappeared after informing his family that he had a meeting with Gacy regarding a job opportunity. Concerned friends and family prompted the police to scrutinize Gacy's activities more closely. What they encountered inside Gacy's residence was a house of horrors. The air was tainted with the scent of decay as the police uncovered a gruesome maze of concealed rooms housing the remains of his victims. The nation was left in shock, appalled by the depth of Gacy's malevolence. Gacy's trial became a media sensation, with the world watching as he confronted justice for his unspeakable crimes. He faced 33 murder charges, solidifying his status as one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Despite his attempts to claim insanity, Gacy was convicted in 1980. In 1994, after more than a decade on death row, John Wayne Gacy met his demise via lethal injection. The nation breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that this fiend would never harm another soul. Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born in Brazil in 1954, where his life was marked by violence and tragedy from a young age. At the tender age of 13, Pedro committed his first murder, taking the life of his town's vice mayor in a fit of rage. He went on to commit several more homicides before his 18th birthday. What truly made Pedro Filho notorious, however, was the staggering number of victims and the extreme brutality of his crimes. Pedro's actions were characterized by a level of cruelty that was difficult to comprehend. He often claimed to have killed for moral reasons, targeting individuals he believed were criminals or had wronged his family. One of his most gruesome acts involved decapitating his father, whom he accused of abusing his mother. Pedro proudly displayed the severed head as evidence of his revenge. Pedro's reign of terror came to an end in 1973 when he was arrested for his crimes. However, his capture didn't halt the bloodshed. While in prison, he continued to take lives, killing at least 47 inmates he perceived as threats. His ability to escape justice within the confines of the prison system earned him a reputation as a ruthless and cunning murderer. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's case became one of the most infamous in Brazilian legal history. He faced multiple murder charges, and his defense team argued that he was legally insane. Nevertheless, he was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to over 400 years in prison. Under Brazilian law, though, the maximum time an individual can serve behind bars is 30 years. This meant that, despite his numerous convictions, Pedro would eventually be released. In 2007, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was released from prison after serving his maximum 30-year sentence. His release sent shockwaves throughout the nation, as many feared he might resume his killing spree. However, Pedro appeared to have mellowed with age. On the 6th of March 2023, Pedrinho Matador met the same fate he had subjected others to. He had his throat slit and was fatally shot outside a family member's residence in Brazil. Luis Garavito. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, known as the Beast, was a Colombian serial killer responsible for the murders of at least 138 children between 1992 and 1997. Garavito was born on January 25, 1957 in Genova, Colombia. As an adult, he preyed on young boys between the ages of 6 and 16 who were vulnerable and from impoverished backgrounds. Garavito would gain the boys' trust by offering gifts, food, or money. Once alone, he would sexually assault, torture, and murder them. The victims' bodies were often mutilated and discarded. Garavito admitted to 138 murders, but the actual number is suspected to be much higher. For years, Garavito evaded capture through frequent changes of identity and appearance. In 1999, he was finally apprehended by a specialized investigative unit of the Colombian police. Garavito confessed to his extensive crimes, providing details that assisted authorities in locating victims' remains. In 2000, he was found guilty of 138 counts of murder and initially sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum penalty in Colombia at the time. This sentence was later reduced to 22 years due to Garavito's cooperation. The decision was highly controversial given the enormity of his crimes. Garavito's serial murders rank among the most prolific in history. The case drew worldwide attention and outrage, both for the scale of the killings and the vulnerability of the victims. Garavito remains imprisoned in Colombia. So after listening to their narratives, do you think the title of the most evil man in the world holds true? Let us know in the comments. And for more captivating videos like this, simply click on the card on your screen right now.